White Jolene Anderson and Squest. Hello, my name is Jolene Anderson. I come to you today from the Secwepemc Nation. Um, this is my UVic reflections of key learnings from my class Indigenous 520. My name is Jolene Anderson, as I mentioned, and the topic this week is on self-determination. The one phrase that stood out for me during this week's reflection was, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house," by Audre Lorde. And I hope that I can explain it well enough that you will be able to understand how this phrase really stood out for me. And I invite you to come along with me in this learning journey, as most of these concepts are raw, they're real, and they reflect my own Indigenous worldview. And many of the times in my reflections, I'm voicing things for the first time. So thank you for listening, and thank you for your patience as we delve into the reflections on the readings. Okay, so the first reflection reading that I'm going to base my reflection on is by Hazlitt, whereas he speaks about the proximal, intermediate, distal, and social determinants of health. The proximal, intermediate, and distal are broken down as being the proximal being direct impact, including behaviors in one's physical and social environment. The intermediate being the origin that includes community infrastructure, resources, systems, and capacities. The distal being the underlying or the construction of proximal intermediate determinants include historical, political, social, and economical contexts of Indigenous lives. Basically, all the social determinants of health, including, and probably most importantly, including the colonial context history that has impacted contemporary Indigenous health. And I say that the distal determinants, which is the underlying of the construction that includes historical, political, social, and economic context of health and Indigenous lives, is important and very significant in mentioning right now, especially for Indigenous health, because as Hassett put, the causative factors of health are found outside of the general health system and require crossing boundaries for policymakers. So the basic health system that we have now that's is basically created for non-Indigenous people, because it doesn't classify, it doesn't clarify, it doesn't include how the colonial historical context has impacted Indigenous lives, because Indigenous lives are seen to be different, and Indigenous worldviews are different than non-Indigenous worldviews. So the basic general health system right now that we are using is for non-Indigenous people. Another quote from Hassett is that social determinants of health and Indigenous rights are not always recognized within government policy, and when they are not a priority for action within the policy implementation. So that goes the same with addressing the historical colonial context that has damaged Indigenous people currently. That if the government were to address and recognize the damages that they have done to Indigenous people, then they would have to change policies that impact Indigenous people. But that is not being done right now. So basically, social determinants of health model reflects the Indigenous worldviews, both historically and contemporarily, which is where I got the reflection, the new learning, basically indicating that self-determination is rooted in worldviews. So with the self or the social determinants of health model, if we were to utilize that openly in the health system overall, it would change the construct. It would change the construct of our health system, our current health system right now. And I can't see that happening until historical context of colonialism and the damages done to Indigenous people are reflected, are acknowledged by the government system. So building off of my first learning about how the self-determinants of health are interconnected to the historical impacts brought on by colonial constructs, and how that has determined the contemporary issues we experience today, is my second lesson that came from the video and message by Dr. Wilson. She says this: the major importance of land-based education is a way of undoing colonial hierarchies and oppression that is connected to Indigenous values, all of which connect us to our land and spirits. This statement demands the reclamation of Indigenous values as a way to decolonize the way we look at health systems. Also, her statement, with the thousands of years of connection to the land comes a certain knowledge, which had me thinking about how different my worldview is compared to how my ancestors experienced it. The lack of connection to land I had because of how I grew up disconnected from my community and how the colonial health policies withheld information from me. Now that I live in my own community, I'm working to decolonize my own thoughts and ideologies, working hard to shift my worldview that honors and upholds my ancestors' knowledge. I can now see how harmless policies and ideologies of settler colonialism translates into severe damages to Indigenous people, leading into the contemporary health issues of today, further demonstrating that self-determination and Indigenous ways of knowing can be tied and is greatly tied to land-based policies and healing strategies for Indigenous people. I'm going to quickly move into my third reading, which was by Richmond, whereas he speaks about the era of settler colonialism that oppresses Indigenous ways of knowing is being challenged. This can vividly be witnessed in Richard's article when it stated that despite the histories of political, economical, and social oppressive policies, Indigenous people have begun to exercise their rights for self-determination and research. And again, this can be brought forward into my fourth reading, actually the West Bank video, rights of self-determination. I was so inspired to see this video of self-determination by the West Bank Nation, whereas they basically seen and recognized and were accountable to the system, the imposed chief and council system that was not working for them, that was imposed by the Indian Act. They were able to see it, they called it out. The community was saying that this system does not work for us. Um, it's a type of leadership model that is not working for us. People were not being held accountable for legal affairs, funding, budgets, um, business developments. All of these things were being controlled by the chief and council leadership and not being um, a community driven process. So I took a lot away from this video because I also work in a First Nations community. We do follow the imposed chief and council system. I am a social worker. I am tasked with the ability to, uh, receive a budget, a program. So I am in control of some of the spending and building programs from my budget. And what I'm taking away from this, what I'm reflecting on it, is that this needs to be a community-driven process. Um, I'm not the only one, in this community. There are 680 other members who have not voiced, who have not heard their voices. Um, and so that does not speak to self-determination and and our indigenous ways of knowing. Um, so when I think of a program that I need to build, um, I know that now what I need to do is to approach the community, do community events where I'm able to poll or survey their thoughts and ideas on what needs to happen, what do they see needs to happen. So I see that I'm out of time, but this is my reflection from the Unit 5, Self-Determination of Indigenous Ways. Thank you.